Hello and welcome to this video on tinnitus management. If you have not seen my first video on what tinnitus is and what are its symptoms, I'll link it down below. In this video, we are going to talk more about the different techniques that we can employ in order to habituate to the tinnitus and live a much more happier, fulfilling life without tinnitus being very intrusive. Now, this video is slightly on the longer side, and that is because I wanted to explain to you all of the underlying principles behind most of the management techniques. So I will write down the timestamps below, but I just wanted to say that if you are a person who's had tinnitus for a very long time and you find it either overwhelming, overbearing, or very intrusive and bothersome, please try and take the time to go through the entire video, because there are certain concepts that when understood, it'll help you employ the techniques in a much better way. I myself have had tinnitus for a very long time, and the one thing that I can actually say is that understanding my tinnitus has helped me cope with it in a much more better way. So let's begin. Hi there! Before we begin this video, if you're new to this channel, my name is Prajakta and I am a senior audiologist working within the NHS. I have over a decade's experience in the field and I do specialize in tinnitus. In all these years, I have helped over 1,000 people keep tinnitus at bay and live a very good quality of life, which is why today I will discuss tinnitus management approaches with you together. The first thing we need to know about tinnitus management is that the techniques we employ for treating tinnitus when a person has hearing loss differs from the techniques employed when a person with tinnitus has normal hearing. So what I would want to do is first we'll understand the process of hearing, that is how we hear, and then see how hearing loss relates to tinnitus. And after that, we will discuss tinnitus management for individuals with normal hearing. So over here, you can see a diagram that explains hearing. What I'd like to do is explain to you how we hear first, followed by what happens when we have a hearing loss, and how hearing loss can then cause tinnitus. Okay, so first we'll have a look at the diagram on the left. The blue arrow that you can see is the direction of the sound from the environment. The sound travels into the ear canal and hits the eardrum. The eardrum then starts to move and transmits the vibrations through a chain of bones into the inner ear. Now your inner ear, or the cochlea, is the purple spiral that you can see in the diagram. The cochlea has a membrane called the basilar membrane, and this one has lots of cells called hair cells that convert the incoming sound into electrical impulses that are in proportion to the loudness and the pitch of the sound, and these electrical impulses are picked up by the nerve and then sent to the brain. Okay, this is generally how we hear. So the cells in the cochlea, they generate an accurate representation of the sound that they've heard. So they make sure that the loudness of the sound and the pitch of the sound matches the incoming sound, and then the same representation is transferred to the brain. But what happens in an individual with hearing loss? Okay, in an individual with hearing loss, certain cells inside the cochlea get damaged. Okay, so the important bit over here that we must remember is that in the cochlea, on the basilar membrane, each cell corresponds to a particular tone. There's a group of cells that corresponds to one particular pitch, and for every pitch that we hear, every frequency that we hear, there are different regions of the cochlea that respond. Okay, so if I say that a person has hearing loss, it may not be that he's not hearing all frequencies. He might have certain regions that he's hearing perfectly well, but he may have some regions that he's struggling with. So we generally come across people who can hear certain pitches very nicely, but then they struggle with the high pitched sounds, or something like that. So what happens is, when there is a loss, the sound from the environment is not correctly represented in the form of electrical impulses. So when that representation reaches the brain, the person might still feel like they've either misheard something, or speech sounds unclear, distorted. We often find people with hearing loss saying things like, I think they mumble, like the person who speaks to me, I don't think they speak clearly. And the reason why the individual with hearing loss senses this lack in clarity is because there are certain hair cells or sensory cells in their cochlea which fail to represent the pitch and the loudness of the sound they've heard in the correct manner. So, generally, with our auditory system that is in the brain, what happens is it is used to receiving a certain level of input from the environment. Okay, so before the onset of a hearing loss, every individual has at one point near normal hearing. And hearing loss is something that starts very, very gradually. So it happens over time. So most of us, we don't realize it until your hearing has dropped down to a significant level, So when your brain starts realizing that, okay, the amount of auditory input that it was getting from the environment has reduced, it then starts thinking, where has the missing sound gone? I mean, why is this person receiving lesser input from the environment now? And it tries to fill the gap of the missing information. It's constantly looking and trying to understand where the missing sound's gone. Okay, so what your brain then does is sends a signal to the healthy parts in your ear to compensate for the regions where there is a drop in our hearing. So it tells certain regions of your ear to work harder so that they can support the region where there's a drop in our hearing. Okay, so this process, it adds a lot of strain or stress on the ear, and when the cells get stressed or there's additional strain on them, they start giving out a distortion. Okay, and the distortion is generally of the same frequency range which your ear is trying to compensate for. Okay, and that your brain, it then picks that distortion up, thinking that it's the missing sound. Okay, because it's constantly looking to fill the gap or bridge the gap of the missing sound, it mistakenly thinks that the distortion created by the fatigued cells is the missing sound and starts paying attention to it. And that's the tinnitus that we hear. So it's basically trying to supply the brain with auditory information that it thinks it's missing. So generally your ear is not in this state of strain because the cells are healthy. It can hear everything from the environment. But when that stops, it then tries to look for the missing sound and in turn wrongly picks up this distortion that is caused due to a lot of fatigue in your auditory system, because it has to compensate for the drop. Okay, and that's where the tinnitus arises from. That's the link between hearing loss and tinnitus. I'm just going to try and give a very simple example from our everyday lives, okay? Just to try and reinforce the understanding of the concept that I've discussed in the previous slides. So imagine that you've gone into work one day and your colleagues not come in. So your manager tells you, hey, can you take up some extra work, because your colleague's not in? Can you meet her targets or do this presentation because we were supposed to give it tomorrow? And although, you're not really happy about it, but, because you're all a part of the same team, you say, okay, why not? It's just for another day. I can do it and I'll take up her extra work. So you do the work, the presentation's done, everybody's happy. The same thing happens the next day and after that. And what if it continues for a whole month? You're not going to continue doing extra work every day for the rest of the month. Once you reach a certain number of days, you will get very tired, and then you will go to your manager and say, I was trying to help out, but I've been doing so much of extra work. It's been more than 30 days. I cannot do this anymore because I'm getting tired. When I go home, my work-life balance is really bad. We need to do something and either get somebody to substitute a colleague, or we need to delegate this work to someone else, isn't it? You're not going to continue taking up that extra load because you get tired, you get fatigued, and it starts affecting your health. This is exactly the same thing that happens with the cells in your ear as well. When your hearing starts to drop off, the healthy cells are happy to support, hearing in that region, but only up to a certain limit. When your hearing starts to drop off further, the amount of support that it needs increases tremendously. So it becomes very stressful for the healthy cells to keep listening to the sounds that they're supposed to listen to, plus during their spare time immediately give that effort in listening to other frequencies as well. Okay, so the distortion that the healthy cells generate is a form of complaining that they do. So they don't have a voice, so they can't tell your brain that, okay, I'm not going to do this. But the distortion is evidence enough that there's a lot of strain and that the healthy cells are not able to cope up. Okay, so it's their way of telling that we need to support the ear and your hearing in some way. So generally, how can we help when this happens? Rather than having the healthy cells overwork and compensate for the drop in your hearing, hearing aids can offer that support. Once an individual with hearing loss gets an appropriate hearing aid, the hearing aid would then amplify the necessary frequencies for the ear so that the healthy cells can go back to doing their own job of listening to the frequencies that they're supposed to and then get the rest they need, because the hearing aid is now lending a supportive hand. So when that happens, the healthy cells will stop generating the distortion. If the distortion is reduced, the brain's not going to pick up on it. Your brain also stops looking for the missing sound because the hearing aid is now supplying the sounds that it was missing before. See? So this is how a hearing aid can actually benefit in helping you hear better and to lower the tinnitus as well. So basically, the hearing aids help to restore the auditory stimulation that your brain is used to, the auditory stimulation from the environment. And once, because it's restored that amount of stimulation, it stops looking for the missing sounds. By giving your brain the missing sounds, it's also doing another thing. It is amplifying and giving your brain access to the environmental sounds that you were missing, thereby lowering the contrast between the tinnitus and the environment. So you would have noticed, as a person who suffers from tinnitus, that when you're out and about, when there's a lot of hubbub around you, or you've gone out for a walk and there's a lot of noise, the tinnitus feels softer. Tinnitus generally is very loud and disturbing whenever you're in a quieter environment, and that is because the tinnitus stands out in comparison to the environment around you. So if it's really, really quiet, it's easier for your brain to focus on the tinnitus because it's so prominent. Whereas if you're outside and the environment is rich with auditory stimulation, the contrast between the tinnitus and the environment is very less. So it makes it harder for your brain to pick up on the tinnitus when there's a lot of sound around you. So your hearing aid would help by lowering the strain on your auditory system and lowering the tinnitus percept by enhancing the environment around you, which helps lower the contrast. Okay. Hearing aids now, they are quite modern, they have a very good technology. Most of the hearing aids are digitized and they can be set to your particular hearing levels, and they also come with inbuilt tinnitus sound generators. Now, what is a tinnitus sound generator and how do we use it? I'm going to talk about it in the forthcoming slides. So now that we've discussed how hearing loss relates to tinnitus and how hearing aids can help reduce it or lower the tinnitus, I want to discuss what and how do we manage tinnitus in individuals who don't have hearing loss. Okay, so like I had said in my previous presentation about the causes of tinnitus, there are several tinnitus can happen because of stress and mental health, overall mental health as well. So if a person is under considerable stress either on the personal front or related to work, or have had a recent bereavement or any significantly life altering events, then stress can also manifest itself in the form of tinnitus. So it is very important for the holistic treatment of tinnitus that we manage our overall mental health and give importance to that as well. So if a person has normal hearing, okay, but they are struggling with tinnitus, the first thing we have to do is try and understand what if the person is under considerable stress on any front and manage that effectively. And we can also use sound therapy and divergent techniques as the main modalities of treatment in these situations. Now, this being said, it is important that we remain wary of the fact that sound therapy and diversion is not only for people with normal hearing, but it can also be used in conjunction with hearing aids for people with hearing loss. Okay. So before we actually go into the steps of using sound therapy, it is very important for us to understand the underlying principles behind sound therapy. So that's what we are going to go into now. The first thing I want to do is to help you understand how our brain processes sounds. Okay, in our brain there are, imagine if you will, okay, any new or incoming sound, any sound that is novel to your brain gets categorized into one of these three main categories. Okay, one is warning sounds, one is important sounds, and one is unimportant sounds. So I want each and every one of you to think about yourselves and how you felt when the tinnitus started, and try and relate yourself to this example and see if it's making sense. Okay, warning sounds are those sounds which your brain cannot ignore. Okay, so imagine that you are sitting down doing a task with utmost concentration, okay, but suddenly your phone rings or somebody calls your name or somebody knocks on your door. You will still turn around and look. Okay, even if you are deeply engrossed in maybe doing a crossword puzzle or you're doing your work and suddenly you hear your name, you will still look because your brain is attuned to that. Your brain knows that if somebody calls you, it may be something urgent and you shouldn't ignore it. So you respond to it. And we can evoke a similar reaction to doorbells, mobile phone rings, alarms, smoke alarms, fire alarms, emergency sounds. somebody telling you to exit the room. So anything that's threatening or poses danger is often a warning sound. Okay, warning sounds generally get more than 80% of attention from your brain. Okay, regardless of how deeply engaged in another task you are, you will almost always respond to warning sounds. Important sounds, on the other hand, are sounds that convey meaning to you. So, your everyday conversations, like this presentation that you're hearing now, okay? Your brain knows that, okay, this is English, they're talking, she's using meaningful words, and she's explaining something. So, it recognizes that this is something where information is being exchanged, okay? But it still doesn't know how valid it is for you. So it gives it around 50% of attention and then leaves it to you to increase or decrease your attention based on how relevant this particular conversation is for you. Now, because right now I'm talking about tinnitus, we're trying to understand tinnitus and come across and understand management options. It'll Your brain might just tell you, okay, this is meaningful. If you like it, increase the attention to 65 or 70. If you think this is not relevant, you can lower it down to 30 or 40. So if rather than talking about tinnitus, if I suddenly start talking about, say, my favorite movie or the Taylor Swift concert, and many of you would think, what is she talking about? And then, start to drift away. Whereas if I start explaining the steps of doing sound therapy, you would then start paying a bit more of attention. So, important sounds are most of our everyday conversations where your brain allocates about 50 to 60% of their attention resource, leaving a bit of leeway up to you to see whether you want to heighten your attention or reduce your attention. Unimportant sounds, on the other hand, are sounds that are non-meaningful, sounds that don't give you any value addition. Something like your air conditioner, or if you're driving, the traffic outside. So say you're listening to this video right now and somebody walks past your room, okay? Or you hear somebody else chatting outside your window. You can hear that, but it won't necessarily distract you from paying attention to me, okay? So these sort of sounds are generally classed as unimportant sounds, and they get about 30% or lesser of attention allocation from your brain. Okay, so what I now want to do is relate the same concept to your tinnitus. So going back to, I'll use myself as an example because in the beginning of this video I did tell you that I have had tinnitus for a very long time. So when my tinnitus started, which is in around 2009, I think, when my tinnitus started, I was very worried about it. So, in the beginning, I thought, when I had it, I thought, oh, what is this sound? And I was okay. I thought it'll go away in a day or two. So I was not very worried. So when it first started, I probably just did something like that. I thought, is it wax in my ears? I used some olive oil drops and I thought it will get better because it did come on quite suddenly. And I was very hopeful that it'll go away by itself spontaneously. So at this point, my brain, because tinnitus was a new sound, it did not know which category it goes into. Is it an unimportant sound? Is it important, or is it a warning sound? But because I was not overly worried about it in the beginning, my brain thought, okay, Prajakta's not thinking about it a lot, so perhaps it's an unimportant sound, and it puts it aside. But it was only when it was more than 2 weeks and the tinnitus did not go away, but in fact it was getting a bit more louder now, it was getting a bit more noticeable. This is the point when I started reading about it. I went to Google and I put ringing sound in the ear. what is it? And then I had a lot of information about tinnitus come up, and about how it can be lots of different problems, that it's a symptom of a lot of different serious issues, or stuff like it doesn't have a cure, it's never going to go, or you have to live with it. And when I read all of these things, it obviously got me very worried about what it is. At this point, my brain started to recognize that I am, in fact, thinking about the tinnitus. And that's when it thought, okay, this is not an unimportant stimulus, because Prajakta is paying attention to it. She's thinking about it. It's obviously something that's important to her. And then it starts paying a bit more attention to the tinnitus. And tinnitus then transitions from being an unimportant sound to an important sound. Now, when any sound comes into the important bin, this is a very critical juncture, because this is the region where your brain interacts with systems that take care of your emotional responses. So in our brain, our body has two systems. It has the rest and digest system and the flight or fight system. Okay, so if you're worried about something, it suddenly triggers the flight or fight responses in our body, and we become more aware of the tinnitus, because now we are worried that it might be something sinister. We are anxious that it might never go away. And when we start getting these thoughts, our body, the blood starts rushing, your heart starts beating faster. You may have noticed that if you're tired, or you're worried about something, or you're just angry and frustrated, there are certain changes from within your body. Something like, your heartbeat increasing, your pulse rate going, throbbing, and all of these sounds, they add on to the tinnitus, and your tinnitus feels louder. This is when your body starts treating tinnitus as a threat, and it then transitions to being a warning sound. Now that the tinnitus has become a warning sound, you're almost always aware of it, regardless of being in a quiet environment, trying to watch the television, trying to do your tasks, going to work. Now you're always aware of the tinnitus, because it has now become a warning sound, a sound that receives more than 80% of your attention, because your brain has mistakenly thought that tinnitus is something that's a threat to you. Okay, you see how from being something as simple as an unimportant sound, now the tinnitus has transitioned to being important and finally a warning sound. What we really need to do is to help our brain understand that tinnitus is just a symptom. It's not a threat to my body. It's never ever going to hurt my hearing. It's not going to cause my hearing to go worse. Okay, it is not a tumor in my brain. Okay, and help lower the amount of attention that your brain is giving it. And this can only happen if the sound transitions back to being an unimportant sound, where it can filter it out and keep it aside. Okay, so the basic reason for me to tell you this thing about how our brain processes sounds is to help you understand that it is possible for tinnitus to transition from being something that is completely not bothersome to being something so intrusive that your brain is almost always aware of it. So how do we now help the tinnitus come down from being a warning sound to being an unimportant sound? Because this is the only way in which your brain is going to be able to filter the tinnitus out, put it into the background, so that it's not disturbing for you. Okay, how do we do this? We do this by helping your brain understand your preferences. Okay, I'm going to take yet another example here. Okay, this time the example of my favorite color. Okay, before I jump into this example, let me ask you, okay, if I ask you three questions like, who is your best friend, or let's take this one. What's your favorite color? Or who is your favorite author? Or who is your favorite singer? Who's your best friend? All 5 of these questions would have elicited an answer in your brain. And how is that? How does your brain know who's your best friend? Or what's your favorite sport? Or your favorite food? Or favorite color? How does your brain know that? It understands your preferences by analyzing the choices you have made since you were a baby till now. Okay? In this example of my favorite color, I'm going to tell you how our attention level towards one particular stimulus helps strengthen a particular association in our brain. So when I was younger, when I was a child, obviously I didn't have a favorite color. I didn't have a favorite color at that time because I was still exploring the world. Okay, so all of the colors, all of the colors in the example here, you can see our initial attention level is 3 for every color. But then as I was growing up, I would have probably picked up a yellow toy, a yellow bag, a yellow jumper. I may have gone out to a friend's birthday party, picked up a yellow balloon. And each of these isolated events, when I've chosen the color yellow, my brain registers it and it stores it. So it's aware that whenever Prajakta had to make a choice of colors, she has always consciously chosen the color yellow. So what it then does is it increases the amount of attention for the color yellow to 7, whereas all the other colors still remain at 3. So the next time I go somewhere and I have to say, pick out a dress, if I see a yellow dress, my brain will take my attention towards that first, because it thinks Prajakta's always liked the color yellow before, so maybe she'll like the same now, and it takes my attention towards the dress. So this is how it remembers our preferences. Okay, so over here, I'm consciously making a choice to choose the color yellow, and that's how it's become my preference. But with our tinnitus, we are not consciously choosing to listen to it. Okay, it's more a subconscious process, and I'll tell you what happens when it comes to our tinnitus. So with regards to our tinnitus, it is quite fascinating really, because as opposed to making conscious choices, when, like discussed in the previous slide, maybe your favorite movie or your favorite food, over here you're making those choices consciously. But tinnitus is something that, we subconsciously pay attention to whenever the background is really quiet. Okay, so typically during nights or early mornings, or maybe you've come back from work and you're just resting, or you want to curl up and read a book somewhere in the quiet, when there's no sound in your environment, the contrast between the tinnitus in your ears against the very, very evident quietness in your surroundings is very high. So it's easier for your brain to fixate on the tinnitus because it is a familiar sound. So it subconsciously starts paying attention to the tinnitus because it has nothing else to focus on, and mistakenly gives a signal to your brain that this is something that you like, and it starts paying attention to it. Okay, so it is wrongly saving your tinnitus as a preference because it has nothing else to focus on or choose from. Okay, and I wish there was a way of telling your brain that no, I don't want to listen to the tinnitus, but because there is nothing else to divert or redirect its attention to, it mistakenly fixates on the tinnitus and wrongly stores it as your preference. Now, if we want to help your brain understand that no, given a choice between choosing tinnitus and something else, I would always like the second option, what we need to do is give your brain a choice between two things. So, a good way to help your brain understand your preferences is by giving it a choice of listening to two sounds. So, what we can do is, give your brain either the option of focusing on the tinnitus or listening to another tone, which can be any of these stimuli that you can see up on the screen. So it can be a podcast or an audiobook or ebook, or it can be a sleep story if you're a person who enjoys more forms of active listening, or it can be passive listening stimuli such as the radio, white noise, meditative sounds, or binaural beats. Okay. What is important over here though is to understand that we don't want to drown the tinnitus out, because your brain wouldn't know what you prefer unless you make a choice. Okay, so if you try to drown the tinnitus out, you're not actually giving your brain two options and picking one from it. You're forcing it to listen to just the one stimulus. So, say if you drown your tinnitus out by playing the television so loud that you cannot hear the tinnitus at all, the moment you stop the television, it's immediately going to fixate on the tinnitus again. Whereas, if you play the television at a volume that's below the level of the tinnitus, not massively below it, but just a notch below the tinnitus, you're giving your brain option 1 and option 2. Okay, the first option is focusing on the tinnitus, the second option is focusing on the television. And because you're paying attention to the television, it's going to redirect attention from the tinnitus towards the television because that's something that you're enjoying more. So it understands that given a choice between listening to the tinnitus or the television, you prefer the television. Okay, that's the same with music as well. It's the same with a podcast as well. So if you give the brain an option of focusing on the tinnitus or listening to meditative music like ocean waves or beach waves, your brain would automatically focus on the beach waves rather than the tinnitus. So imagine that you do this every day for a period of 2 weeks or period of 3 weeks. At the end of the third week, if you give your brain the same two options, that is either listening to the tinnitus or listening to the podcast, it will automatically choose the podcast over the tinnitus because it would think in the last 2 weeks, this person has not at once paid attention to the tinnitus. So, why would he want to pay attention to it now? So, it automatically understands that whenever you've had a choice of listening to the podcast or the tinnitus, you've always chosen the podcast. So, it'll automatically start lowering the attention for the tinnitus and redirecting it towards the podcast. Okay, and it's not that you have to use the podcast throughout your life. Okay, it is once your brain understands that you don't prefer the tinnitus, it is going to start transitioning from being a warning sound to an important sound, and eventually from being an important sound to an unimportant sound. Once this transition takes place, it would automatically learn to put the tinnitus aside so that you're not aware of it. It learns to just filter it out of the system. So, in order to, this whole process is called habituation. Okay, in habituation, what we really need to do is help your brain redirect attention away from the tinnitus and focus on a stimulus that you like. And the stimulus can be anything from active forms of listening to passive forms of listening. There are certain applications that you can have in your phone which give you the choice of listening to sleep stories or podcasts or combining several environmental sounds to create your own soundscape. And I will list down the apps in the presentation here and in the notes below. But what is important is to ensure that you're not drowning the tinnitus out, because I don't want you to give your brain or force your brain into listening to one stimulus but you have to help your brain understand that if you ever had a choice between two things, you would always prefer the second thing over the tinnitus. And once your brain learns this preference, the tinnitus won't be as audible or as bothersome as it is presently, because it would have transitioned to being an unimportant sound. I just wanted to reinforce on the same thing that, these are the main points to remember, really, that we should never ever try to drown the tinnitus out. If you do, then your brain will not get two choices. It would be forced to pay attention to only one stimulus that you give. Once you stop that stimulus, it will automatically go back to your tinnitus again. So, to help it understand what is the tone that you would want to listen to, give it a choice between your tinnitus and the secondary stimulus. It can be music or the podcast or anything, and pay attention to that stimulus over the tinnitus so that it remembers, recognizes, and stores this preference for the future. You have to be consistent with this method. Habituation does take place, but it only needs time, okay? Once it recognizes your preferences, it will set the tinnitus aside, and that itself is called habituation. So, habituation is nothing but our ability to filter out a particular sound, out of our attention or awareness. So, essentially, anything that your brain filters out, it considers as being unimportant. Okay? And it would come as a surprise to you, but as human beings, we are constantly filtering out unwanted stimuli. If we fail to filter things out, we will get very, very overwhelmed. So, all of our senses, vision, sense of touch, smell, taste, hearing, each of our sensory systems is constantly filtering information out. And, an easy example would be a person living near a busy road. Over time, they might not find the road busy at all. In fact, they would even stop hearing that sound. But if you visit that person's house, you might then feel like, wow, that road is really busy. But if you ask your friend, how does he or she cope with living right across the road, they might just say, oh, it's something I've gotten used to. Or another example of habituation is putting on your perfume in the morning. See, the person who puts the perfume on, they can't smell their own perfume after maybe even 15-20 minutes, but people around them can smell it. Or if you wear a new piece of jewelry, maybe a ring or something, you can feel it on your skin for the first few days or months, but after that, you can't feel it anymore, can you? So, now you would have probably, if you wear a ring, you might touch it now and say, oh, yeah, yes, this is true. Or, this sort of filtering keeps happening naturally in our life. And this is the same thing that we need to happen with our tinnitus as well. And this is why we do sound therapy, to help your brain understand that I would rather prefer to hear this tone and not the tinnitus. And once this preference gets stored, your brain would be able to put the tinnitus aside to such a level that it may not be audible to you at all. The aim of all of the tinnitus management strategies that we've discussed today is not to get rid of the tinnitus, but to help you habituate to it. So it's very important to accept the tinnitus, because you want your brain to understand that this is not a threat to your body. Okay? If you think about tinnitus as something that's dangerous for you or is a threat for you, it'll be very hard for you to habituate to it. Also, constantly looking for the cause of tinnitus is also going to hinder habituation, because it sends a signal to your brain that you're worried about it. Okay, tinnitus is very, very rarely something, indicative of something sinister. And most of the times, once you come to your audiologist and we do the assessments, if there are any red flags, they will get assessed. So if you are worried about something, if you think that the tinnitus may be an underlying symptom of something else, please make that appointment with your GP to meet your audiologist, get the assessments done, and get reassured that everything is okay, because that's going to help you move towards habituation. You may be aware that there are certain times when tinnitus actually becomes less noticeable, like maybe when you are busy at work, or maybe when you've gone and met your best friends, or you've met your family, you've gone out for an outing. When you're doing these things, tinnitus becomes less noticeable, partly because your environment is rich with sounds and auditory stimulation, but partly because you're enjoying yourself, you're a lot more relaxed. So, your overall well being, your mental status, your emotional health, all of this is also very important to bring tinnitus percept down. For some people, understanding the tinnitus, getting the reassurance they need, is all they really need in order to manage the tinnitus. Whereas for few individuals, you need to get hearing aids and use the management strategies. Okay. Let's have a look at this little diagram I have on the next slide so that you get a more visual representation of everything that we've discussed right now. So if you have a look at this diagram here, you can see that the y-axis shows us the level of the tinnitus, that is how loud it is, and the x-axis shows us the time. Okay, so the blue line is actually the distress level that is caused because of the tinnitus, and the orange line is the tinnitus itself. Now you can see how the orange line has its own ups and downs, and that's because on some days tinnitus might feel like it's much worse, especially if you're stressed or tired, or on some days tinnitus might feel that it's okay, it's not really that bad, but more or less it's around the same spectrum. So you can see how initially when the tinnitus starts, it is quite distressing, and that's because we don't know what it is. We are unaware of whether it's going to stay like that or it's going to get worse. You also have read a lot of things about it, and most of those things are negative, and you just feel very powerless. And all of this causes a significant amount of distress. But you can see how over time the distress curve starts to reduce and our emotions start improving. So, what was very frustrating and scary before, over a period of time, becomes something you're a bit doubtful about. You're not as scared or worried as you were in the beginning, but you're neither too happy, but you are reaching a point where you can put the tinnitus aside a little bit. And this is because your brain begins to realize that the tinnitus has not actually affected your hearing, it's not affected your health, and that it's not so much of a danger to your health as how you perceived it to be before. So in the beginning of the x-axis, you can see the red emoticon, which obviously shows a very high amount of distress. But as time passed by, you are worried about it, but still much lesser. So initially, the tinnitus was in the warning sound zone, but over a period of time, when your brain realizes that it's not actually doing you much harm, it transitions to being an important sound. Over here, you can see how the orange line starts becoming a dotted line. Now, that means that you have reached a point where the tinnitus has transitioned to being an unimportant sound, which is where if you really focus, you can hear it, but for most parts of the day, you can actually, put it out in the background. and it's not bothersome, and you can see how the levels of distress have become very, very low, and now you can do your everyday tasks, participate in conversations just like you did before, without even noticing that the tinnitus is there. So it's basically just a passage of time, which helps your brain understand that the tinnitus is merely another sound that it needs to filter out, and it's not something to worry about. You have to be consistent and give it time. Habituation does take place, but again, it varies from individual to individual. So, for a person who has attached a lot of negative emotions and meaning to their tinnitus, may need slightly longer to habituate to the tinnitus rather than another individual. Okay, so it may be a few weeks for some, it may be a few months for some others. But if you keep going and using those divergent techniques, using sound therapy, or if you have hearing aids, continue using your hearing aids, it will all cumulatively bring your tinnitus down, and your brain will learn to filter it out. It is only the passage of time. One more important thing that I wanted to highlight on is that practicing relaxation can really, really help to ease tinnitus. There is an extremely strong link between stress and tinnitus. So try and, find out the triggers for your stress, identify what causes you to be stressed or fatigued or tired, and make a plan or come up with remedies to lower the levels of stress in your life. Relax more so that you can feel less stressed. Find that balance between work and life. And if you think that there are certain factors that trigger stress for you, try and find solutions to lower those triggers. Put on some background music or podcasts to help redirect your attention away from the tinnitus and focus on these activities instead. Some people have benefited with, giving some time to their hobbies, maybe mindfulness, maybe take a walk, or gardening, coloring, painting, anything that helps you divert your attention in a good way and helps you relax is always going to bring the tinnitus percept down. It's going to help make the tinnitus softer. I just wanted to put this slide in here because, having been in this field for a very long time, I frequently come across people who express these concerns to me, and I just wanted to say that all of these are really myths, okay? And people think that they're never going to get to enjoy peace and quiet when they have tinnitus, or the tinnitus is going to make them go deaf, it's going to affect their hearing, or that tinnitus always means that it's a tumor in their brain. And I've also had people come in with eardrops and medications that they bought off the counter for tinnitus. So it's very important that you understand that you would still be able to live a very happy and satisfactory life. You will be able to enjoy peace and quiet even if tinnitus is there, because your brain habituates to it and filters it out. It's never ever the case that the tinnitus is going to make your hearing bad. It's actually most of the times an underlying hearing loss that causes the strain on your ears and then leads to tinnitus. Okay, so please don't think that, oh, I have tinnitus and that's going to take my hearing away and then be stressed because of it, because that hardly ever happens. And tinnitus does not mean that there's a tumor in your brain. I've had so many people to ask me this because they've read it on Google. Well, tinnitus can sometimes be one of the symptoms of a tumor sometimes in the brain, but it is so rare, and there are so many associated symptoms that come together as a cluster. Obviously, definitely, when you go in for your tinnitus assessment, if they do pick up on any red flags, they will get it assessed. Or if you have this worry, you can just express it to your doctor rather than stressing on it, because that's only going to make your tinnitus worse. Okay, and definitely, unless the tinnitus is caused by an underlying medical condition or by wax, any sort of over the counter medications or drops will not help in lowering tinnitus. Okay, um, and yeah, I hope overall everything that we've discussed, at least each one of you has found something to take home today. I know it has been a very lengthy video, but that was only because I wanted to go in detail about all of the underlying principles. You can always go back to the bits and parts that you think you want to go over one more time. And um, I'll just summarize everything in the next slide, just a few of the key take home messages, and I will link down the apps, which I think I'll write down the apps and I'll present it in the video. Please give them a go, and if you have any other questions or comments, please write them down for me, and I'll try my best to get back to them. So, to summarize, I would say the take home messages would be that if you feel that you're struggling to hear, and if you have tinnitus, please take that step forward and make an appointment to get your hearing tested or visit your GP. Hearing aids can definitely help with tinnitus if you have hearing loss and tinnitus in conjunction by rehabilitating your hearing. Sometimes it is important to use sound therapy as well, okay, and play soothing music, podcast, or a radio. But be mindful that you're not drowning the tinnitus out. Keep it on a low volume so that your mind doesn't focus on the tinnitus, but it rather redirects attention away from it and facilitates habituation. And finally, please give it time. Habituation does take place. It's happened with me. It will definitely happen with you as well. Don't dwell on the fact that you want to know the cause of the tinnitus or get worried about the fact that when will it go away. Try to do the things you love, the things you enjoy. It'll help your brain understand your preferences, and it'll learn to put the tinnitus aside by itself. It will filter it out, and there'll come a day when you think, oh yeah, I really don't feel very bothered even if I hear the tinnitus. And that's what we want. We are not looking to get rid of it, but we are trying to reach the point where even if you hear it, you can just put it aside without it being overly bothersome. Okay? So this is the basic guideline or framework for doing sound therapy. Always remember that this is not a substitute for medical advice. This is just the basic sort of outline of how we do sound therapy. It's very important to make sure that the volume is set below the tinnitus and that it is at a safe level. Please consult your audiologist if you have any other doubts, and obviously get your assessment done and see the appropriate, discuss the appropriate forms of management that would be applicable for you, okay, because tinnitus therapy does vary from person to person and it is highly individualized. The main purpose of this whole video was to just give you an overview of everything that's available and giving you the reassurance that tinnitus doesn't mean that you have to live with it forever without having any help. Yes, tinnitus is something that we can habituate to. We're not looking to get rid of it, but you can still live a very good quality of life by learning to put it aside, okay? And I've listed the apps and some further reading support in the next few slides. So do check that out. So these are some of the apps that you can use. and these are the websites that you can go to for some additional support and resources. So these are my references for the presentation today. Please go through that if you want any more reading. And until next time, see you. Take care.